So I'm going to be, in the next half an hour or so, talking about the issue of preterm birth and some work that we did in this topic area. And as you've just heard, I'm based at the University of Newcastle. And in fact, on my slides, you'll see reference to the University of Sheffield. I've just moved, relocated, and this was work that I undertook while I was at Sheffield. So for those of you who aren't very well acquainted with the geography of the United Kingdom, this is where I am, very close to Scotland. And you may not unreasonably wonder why I'm going to be talking about the issue of preterm birth and preterm birth in LMIC settings. And I know that all of you have come with an interest in global health, and I will be deferring to your expertise. But my interest in work in developing world contexts has actually been something that has been with me for a long time. And I was working in a malnutrition unit in West Africa. And one of the things that really concerned me about the work that we were doing was that I didn't feel that what we were doing was very effective. And at times I wondered if it was actually quite harmful. One of the interventions that was done at the clinic where I was working was that we would admit both the child with malnutrition and the mother into our unit, and they would stay there for many, many, many weeks. And meanwhile, the rest of the family suffered because they were reliant on the mother growing the crops and so on. So I was very concerned that some of the potential effects of the intervention were very bad for the other children in the family. And also it took us a very, very long time to improve the nutritional status of the children. And I often felt there must be a better way of working. And while I was trying to think, what is a better way of working? There was, in the clinic that I was working in, there was a room which had about 10 boxes of old dusty journals. And I would spend my evenings going through the journals, trying to locate examples of good practice that could help inform what we were doing. The whole experience was quite disheartening, and I don't feel I ever really was able to make positive changes, but I tried. When I returned to the UK, an organisation was getting going called the Cochrane Collaboration. I'm going to come on to that in just a second. But this whole issue of preterm birth, so going back to the Cochrane Collaboration, one of the things that I heard about when I came back was the development of an organisation called the Cochrane Collaboration. I don't know if I can get any feedback from you, but I'd love to know how many of you have heard of the Cochrane Collaboration. But one of the purposes of establishing that organisation was to bring together evidence, and evidence that would inform practice. And I knew that that was an area that I really wanted to get into. So that was really what triggered my interest in the Cochrane Collaboration and my pathway into evidence synthesis. But why preterm birth? Now, as Dominic mentioned at the beginning, preterm birth is a really important issue. There's an estimated 15 million babies, 1 in 10 born preterm, that's before 37 weeks of gestation. This is a number that is rising, and it's the leading cause of neonatal mortality, and also a major, major cause of lifelong disability for many children, with huge consequences for the family. And not only is it a major cause of mortality and morbidity, but also inequality. So the risks of being born at 28 weeks, of surviving are 50% in a developing context. They're only 15% if you're born at 32 weeks in a less developed setting. So incredible inequalities globally. Not only are there inequalities in survival rates, but huge inequalities in rates of preterm birth, with highest rates of preterm birth, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And we're not really not fully sure about why there are those differences, but what is clear is that this huge burden is faced by the poorest in the world. Yes, so going back to how I ended up going into evidence synthesis. And this is the logo for the Cochrane collaboration. And it was this whole area of methodology that I felt drawn to, partly because of my experiences working. Now, when we were tackling this issue of preterm birth, part of the project that we were funded to do was to look at priorities. Now, before I go on and talk any more about that, I just want to talk a little bit about the Cochrane logo. Now, the symbol in the center of that is a meta-analysis, and I'm sure many of you will be very cognizant of what that means, but essentially it's the pooling of trials, and each of the horizontal lines represents a trial, and the vertical line, the line of no difference. And we're going to be talking a bit more about some meta-analysis in a moment. But the reason that I'm introducing that is actually this was one of the first meta-analyses that was published in the Cochrane Library, and it was the review looking at the impact of corticosteroids, and at that time, corticosteroids to improve lung maturation in preterm babies. And it wasn't until that work was published that people realized how significant this treatment was, and slowly practice changed and has subsequently saved many, many lives. So the project that I've just alluded to was one funded by the NIHR. That's the UK government funded us to look at this project, and it was a large project of which the evidence synthesis was only a part of it. And the work that I'm going to be describing has been published in this paper here. And we undertook something called a scoping review, and that's where we decided to look at wide range of interventions, and we looked at systematic reviews. So our aim was to identify systematic reviews that had looked at the effectiveness, safety, and acceptability of interventions to prevent preterm birth. And then we wanted to look at how many of those systematic reviews actually use evidence from low and middle income countries. And this was all part of trying to identify priority research areas in this whole area. And a mapping review approach draws on many of the sort of core aspects of systematic review, so an extensive and transparent identification of the literature. What we didn't do is synthesize the findings, but we were locating existing systematic reviews. So often when we're doing a systematic review, we're asking a very, very specific question. But in a mapping review, we're often wanting to get a bigger picture, and that's the case in this piece of work. We were wanting to look at all of the interventions that would potentially be relevant. We were interested in multiple different types of interventions, so this is why this methodology was more appropriate. One of the things that one of the outputs from this piece of work was something called an interactive evidence and gap map, and it allows the evidence to be plotted and presented in an interactive way. And on that, we were able to plot the studies and also based on where they were undertaken. And I can send you a link to that map, which is live on our website. So just how did we decide what studies to include? Well, we included systematic reviews published between 2009 and 2020. We excluded women with comorbid conditions and excluded women during the labour and postnatal period. So we were limiting the focus of our, because there are so many types of interventions, so that was the limitation that we put on it. So it was interventions during pregnancy and interventions for pregnancy with high risks of preterm birth, as opposed to, say, for example, interventions delivered before pregnancy begins or following birth. So here are the types of interventions: antenatal care, midwifery-led models of care, macronutrient and micronutrient supplements, infection treatment, infection, weight management, smoking cessation, and progesterone cerclage, tocolytic treatment, and cervical pessaries. So those are the interventions that were identified. And we did a lot of screening and included 139 systematic reviews. So for each of those systematic reviews, we identified all of the primary studies that were undertaken. And so that was 1,372 primary studies. And this just gives you an indication of how many reviews there were for each of those topics. And you can see by far that there were more reviews looking at macronutrient supplements. And this just gives you an indication of how many primary studies there were compared to the number of reviews. And again, you can see there were a lot of macronutrient studies and by far the largest number of systematic reviews in that. But this was the thing that began to surprise me. I was coming to this topic as not an expert in preterm birth. I'm not a midwife or obstetrician, and what I was becoming very aware of as I was reading through these 139 systematic reviews was how very few seemed to be very convincing about the effectiveness of any of these types of interventions. And as you'll know, systematic reviews can be of variable quality. So even where I was seeing an effect, I wasn't entirely convinced that that was a true effect, but was questioned not just the quality of the systematic review, but also of the primary studies. So here we are, we've got a major problem affecting, with such a high impact, affecting the poorest with the greatest consequences, and so few treatments that seem to have very much effect. Now, these slides look a little bit messy, and I'll just try and simplify them. So I showed you that forest plot, that simplified diagram in the middle of the Cochrane logo. For each of those systematic reviews, where they had done a summary meta-analysis, I took that data and plotted it. And so you've got the horizontal, the vertical line, which is the line of no difference, where the central circle, that's the effect size, is over to the left. That shows that the treatment is more effective than the control. Where it spans the line of effect, it's non-significant. You can see a lot of them are non-significant. But we have a few that look as if they're promising. And so I group those according to all of the different types of intervention for all of those groups. Now, what I did next was just plotted those that showed an effect. And you can see, so I've plotted them so that the most, from those with the greatest effect down to the least effect, from those that showed a positive effect. What I would say is that that I didn't build into this a quality, so I didn't take out those that were very low quality. A lot of the reviews that were included in this were Cochrane reviews, so we assume that they were higher quality reviews. But anyway, this was just an indication of some of those treatments that looked like they might be most effective, up at the top being use of antibiotics. And then what I did was looked at, of those primary studies, of those reviews, how many of them were supported by evidence from low-income countries. And you can see to the right-hand side, that middle column, the top one there, for the antibiotics for symptomatic bacteriuria, the 0.03. So that was no studies for low-income countries, no studies for upper middle, and 3 for middle income countries. And what you can see, which is, I think, quite staggering, is of those interventions which appear to have an effect, how very, very few are undertaken in low income settings. So the way that we did this was with each of the reviews, we took out the studies, the primary studies, and we then plotted where each of those primary studies came from. So low income, low middle income, and upper middle and high income countries. So that was how we got our data. And this was the distribution of studies. So 68% were undertaken in high income countries. 28% were in LMIC settings, and there were a proportion which weren't reported. But when we looked at those a bit more closely in those categorizations, what was really quite striking was just how very, very few were done in low income settings. So 15% done in low income settings, 35 in low middle, 50 in upper middle income country. So such a very, very small percent, 1.5% of the very total. So those settings where we have a big problem, so few of the studies were drawn from those settings. So this is just a graph which sort of shows you the proportion of primary research in each LMIC setting compared with the rates of preterm birth. And what you can see there is a sort of inverse relationship. And that picture really reminded me of a piece of work that I had read about many years before and had learnt about, which was the inverse care law, the Tudor-Hart inverse care law. And this was a law that, this was a proposal, a theory put forward that actually where we see the greatest need, and Tudor-Hart wrote about access to healthcare and wrote about the phenomena and was really addressing inequalities in this country and described the phenomena where we saw the greatest provision of healthcare services where they were least needed and the least provision where they were most needed. And I remembered having read about this. This was the Tudor-Hart inverse care law, and it reminded me very much of the kind of patterns that we were seeing in the research that was available. Again, where the problem was greatest, there we were having the least amount of research. And this work actually, another study was done after that by Augustin, and this was looking and plotting all of the, this study looked at all studies done in LMIC context addressing maternal health. And again, you can see in that piece of work too, very unequal distribution of where studies are undertaken. Okay, but so what? Does it matter that the research is coming from high income settings? Well, like I showed you in those meta-analysis, in the systematic reviews that include a meta-analysis, what they do is they pull studies, and those studies can be from very, very different contexts. But even if we try and group studies on the basis of their setting, there's even problems with that because, as you will all be aware, there are huge variations within country settings, and countries may be a low or middle income country, and yet within that there'll be incredible diversity. Likewise, in high income countries, there'll be pockets of poverty. And one of the striking differences might be something as very basic as actually how do you get to life-saving obstetric care. And it's estimated that actually to get for people in some rural settings, getting to that level of care can take up to 2 hours. So there'll be some types of interventions where we know that that will matter. And this was some work that I became aware of. So we started thinking about what types of interventions would matter. Where can you say that there are interventions that are tested and recommended and have been developed in high income settings, but are applied in low income settings. And one of those is cervical cerclage. And that's where a stitch is put into the cervix. Now, if a woman is delayed from getting to somewhere to a tertiary unit where, or to a setting where that stitch can be removed, she can end up with torn cervix and actually may never be able to have children in the future. So, and we also know that systematic reviews particularly are really critical when we're developing recommendations for care in both in all kinds of contexts, but they form really the basis, the foundation for development of clinical guidelines. So here we have guidelines being developed, drawing from systematic reviews that may have pooled data without really looking at the context where those primary studies are undertaken. And if we start to look at context, we need to think, well, what are the factors that might be important? And one of the challenges of preterm birth is that it is a complex phenomena where there's multiple different factors that lead to it. There isn't one single risk factor. There's multiple risk factors that compound and interact and include environmental factors, social factors, health service provision factors that all are contributing to causes of preterm birth. And these all make up the context, and those will mediate how effective an intervention might be, potentially any harm, turn an intervention to harmful intervention. So what can we do about it? Well, one of the things that also surprised me about this research was that many of the reviews didn't actually address setting. It wasn't described. So we didn't know in 20% of the reviews what the context was for the primary studies. Most of the reviews describe, so it would be listed where the study was undertaken, but often very, very little information about any more about it, just sort of the country, but we don't know if that was a rural setting, what the profile was of the women, whether issues of poverty, access to health provision, any antenatal care. So very little context was given. In a very, very small proportion, they were analysed. And I'm just going to show you the different ways that the authors attempted to take into account complexity and context. So they used these three different approaches. One was subgroup analysis, one was a visual display, and finally a subgroup analysis based on features of the population. So I'm just going to give you an example of those different things that they used. So here's a way, a review where they grouped together the low and low middle income countries and compared and did the analysis separately. So that's a subgroup analysis. This study was where they undertook it visually. So what you can see here are, instead of the author names, they've put the country. And so it allows you to see on the forest plot, you can see, so what you've got is the line of no difference and then these horizontal lines. And it allows you to sort of visually look and explore what the impact of different countries might be, what the effect size in different countries. And one of the another approach that a study took was looking at breaking it down and looking at different features. They did that doing an individual patient, taking out individual patient data. So here again, this is an approach where they looked at features. So they grouped women based on their BMI. So although they didn't categorize in terms of the country they were from, inevitably those ended up being grouped into low middle income countries, but based on particular features of the population. So that's a brief overview of that study. Charles Mackey ends his books this way: the end, look how far we've come. And one of the things that I think was disheartening about that piece of work was to look at see how little research was informed by studies undertaken in local context, but perhaps also more concerning, how little account was taken of that in the analysis. But what is very positive is that there is an endeavour to apply evidence and to look critically at interventions. And there's an awful lot of uncertainty about the effectiveness of these interventions, and increasingly people addressing whether they will actually be applicable in different global contexts. And so I think things are changing. There's also a lot of work being done on how we approach the analysis, how we take into account. So I think quite soon we'll be seeing changes and improvement in how we manage these issues of context and complexity in meta-analysis. Thank you very much.